Hi, my name is Brooke.
Hi, my name is Maddie.
I'm Annie,
I'm Jacob.
and we're here to talk about A Clockwork Orange. We're going to start with a summary of the book.
So the story sets us off with our protagonist Alex and his gang of fellow teenagers.
It's Drugs.
Called the Drugs. And their multiple crime sprees that they do throughout this entire first section of the novel. As they do all of this, they have their own slang called Nadstak. Nadstak is a combined language of Russian and Cockney English.
And him and his droogs are just chilling in the Korova milk bar, and they, throughout the first part of the book, do all kinds of crimes, such as beating up men in alleyways and stealing their teeth and raping women a lot
While they're on drugs.
while they're on milk-induced drugs.
Yeah.
It's a lot of heinous crimes that they refer to as ultra-violence, which is just a new extreme form of violence that is kind of like normalized in their society. Unfortunately for Alex, his crime spree can't go on for too long because towards the end of part 1, the police come and they intercept him when he's doing some awful crimes, and they arrest him. And his friends are not arrested because they betray him. So he's the only one that gets captured.
While he's in prison for about 2 years, Alex meets his cellmates and he settles into his new prison life. He's always looking for ways out and ways to get hope. So he eventually turns to the prison preacher as a way to escape his small little life at this point. Eventually, a new guy comes into their cell and tries to fondle him in his sleep. And so he convinces the rest of his cellmates to beat this man to death. And eventually he is charged with his murder. And so as a way of forgiveness and trying to escape from jail, he agrees with the government to let them try this new experiment on them called the Ludovico technique.
And so the Ludovico technique is where he gets injected with a medicine that makes him nauseous under the disguise of it being vitamins, wired up to a chair, his eyelids held open, and then shown images and videos of violent sexual acts occurring so that he's classically conditioned to associate the violence and the sexual acts with the nausea that he feels.
As he's on the Ludovico treatment, he is forced to listen to classical music. So when he listens to such pieces by Beethoven, Mozart, whatever, he kind of combines them with the idea of violence, which creates his hatred towards what he once loved. After just a fortnight of treatment, he was released from prison, and he got to go on with life because they were seeing that he was treated successfully.
When he went home, he was met with his parents who had gotten rid of all of his stuff and had a new roommate chilling and renting out his room, whose name was, I believe, Joe.
Classic Joe.
Who pretty much was just super rude to him, which would be no biggie if he could just beat him half to death like he usually did. But at this point, he's been classically conditioned beyond just being ultra violent, is to not have any sort of violence or disagreements or, leaving him defenseless. So when he says stuff about him, he just, at any instinct or any thought of going and doing something about this, he gets sick. Then when the police officers arrive,
and kidnap Alex. One of them is now Dim.
his ex-droog.
Yeah, he's an ex-droog, a part of Alex's gang. And so they take him away and beat him up and leave him off in a field. And prior to this, his release from jail resulted in vengeance from victims of his former crimes. So he's already defenseless and anti-violence, he's being attacked even though he's all rehabilitated, so really the solution had done nothing for him. Though he did find safe haven in someone's home after being welcomed in, and he was wearing a mask, but the man who was taking him in was a victim of one of his crimes from many years ago, where it resulted in the man's wife's death. So after all of this guy took interest in him and his story, and decided to use him for his political agenda for anti-government. And so his story became a widely known thing, and he was exploited.
One time it went to this extent that whole anti-government group locked him in a room and played the classical music that made him sick and reminded him of the violence. And so he couldn't take this to the point where he jumped out the window of the room in an attempt to kill himself. But it didn't quite work that way. It ended up curing him of the Ludovico technique, allowing him to go back to his old ways.
And after he went back to his old ways, he realized that a life of crime was not suited for him anymore, and he was getting almost tired of it. And he wanted to be like his former fellow Droogs, where they sat down and started a new life and just kind of forgot about the ultraviolence and led a life that was simple. And the end of the book drew near with Alex deciding to start a family and raise his...
This episode is sponsored by the Korova Milk Bar. For all your milky, druggy needs, we'll keep you sharp.
Thank you, Brooke. It's Brooke here. And on that note, I was thinking, why don't we start by chatting about the significance of milk in the novel?
Obviously, in the beginning, it talks about like some sort of alcohol prohibition style thing. So instead, they like to put drugs in milk, which
And knives.
not
No,
actually
drugs.
knives.
They don't put actual
Knives.
knives.
Is that what you thought?
Do you think they were drinking razor blades or something?
You can't drink razor blades anyway.
What kind of milk? And you're thinking about prohibition?
Yes, there was this alcohol prohibition, so they had drugs in milk, and so it sort of had this idea of like making them seem more childish or like infantilized because they were drinking milk, which is like
Well, generally innocent.
yeah,
Yeah.
which is sort of paralleled near the end, where near the end of the book he sits down and actually has alcohol after all the Ludovico technique and all that sort of stuff. And so you sort of see this contrast of like how it's like not matured him but like aged him and made him feel as if he's no longer a child.
Beginning of each section, there are 3 sections in the book. The phrase, "What's it going to be then, A?" is repeated several times, and this emphasizes the significance of the meaning behind A Clockwork Orange, which is that an individual is like a clockwork orange, and they have to choose between good and evil in order to survive. And
What's Clockwork Orange?
oh, A Clockwork Orange. Let me find
would
the
explain
quote. Oh, I found it. Okay.
Oh, wow.
Okay, it says, if he can only perform good or only perform evil, then he is a clockwork orange, meaning that he has the appearance of an organism lovely with color and juice, but is in fact only a clockwork toy to be wound up by God or the devil or the almighty state. Well, what's it going to be then, A?
Like reiterating like this choice that he has throughout the whole book as to
Yeah.
who he is.
Yeah, or like who's in charge in his life. Like in the beginning it was him because he was like in like the like hecticness, and then the second part it was whoever was in charge of like his church group in the prison.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Like at that
the
point he wasn't in
Charles.
charge of his life.
Yeah.
And then later has back in control, so he says it again, but it has a different
Yeah.
meaning.
Should we also mention the fact that why his desire of the church and like the Bible and like why he liked it?
He likes the parts that were violent.
He loved the parts that were violent and featured rape. It was all
Yeah.
the stuff that he could relate to in his childhood, which I find very interesting because the aspect of religion is that it's supposed to be relatable, not religiousable, but relatable.
Yeah, it's supposed to draw people in for like one
It's
reason or
supposed to draw
another.
people.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the fact that that's his motivation in prison, like as he's being punished, he's also finding what is supposed to be good. He's finding some bad in it, and he's embracing it.
Yeah. Then there's also the added aspect that was like with the whole Clockwork Orange thing was that to be natural, you have to sort of include both and not just follow one path or the other,
Right.
because you're supposed to be your own like organism, and maybe that was represented through religion, which is sort of seen as something that's ultra human, and seeing that it isn't just all good or all bad.
Yeah, I found another quote that kind of ties into A Clockwork Orange. I believe that this is the Charles who's in church. No, the Charles who is in charge of the church and the prison is saying this, but it says, "The heresy of an age of reason, or some such slavos. I see what is right and approve, but I do what is wrong." And that kind of ties into A Clockwork Orange, because he's actively making a choice to see good and ignore it and choose to be bad.
You may have noticed if you even read like a page of the book, which was the slang, like nadsat is what it's called. It's part Russian, English, and
Cockney, wasn't it?
English, Cockney, and Slavic.
Slavic. And the whole time it's just kind of like this weird thing where it's like, oh, is it a weird statement? And you kind of don't really understand until later in the book. And you find out that the slang was mostly propaganda or subliminal penetration, as it said. And so it's this thing of like, slang is something that like a generation or like people should come up with on their own, but at this point, like with these kids, it's been forced upon them. And so is obviously like a lot of other things, like almost the violence that like you see just generally throughout the book.
As you get further into the book, get more of like this like puppeteering vibe, where it's like the state is controlling them and making them be more violent or more weird in their languages and whatever. So you see sort of this like hand in the mix, so that these differences that are usually developed by the individual generation is now being controlled by the state's authority.
So another generational difference between Alex and the adults was his interest in music. As a normal teenager, he would be subjected to culture norms for liking modern music, though Alex is more into classical music, such as the works of Beethoven and Mozart, which is found very interesting because in the Ludovico technique, he was forced to listen to classical music while on nausea pills and watching violent images and videos. And same thing happened to him, where he had to listen to the classical music against his will, and he was locked in a room and was driven to suicide by F. Alexander in the book, after he used a story to exploit him and use him for his own agenda in campaigning. And then this kind of interesting outlook on his escapism from this modern society. Yes, escapism, fun word. It draws on an interesting idea that Alex is not just a normal character. Like, he plays a cog in the clock, how you can put it.
Yeah, and it's like the weird thing of like, he's supposed to be like this like stereotypical ultra-violent teen, but in that way it almost sets him apart. And you can also talk
Like,
about
there's some peace in him, which is found very interesting because near the end of the book, he doesn't get cured by a violent technique. He gets cured because he has some peace of himself, and he basically grows up. He matures and he decides, hey, I'm kind of tired of this. I want to lead a normal life.
And that's another thing about classical music, that it's almost like the Milk, where it's like Milk versus Alcoholic, which is more adult, and like classical music is generally seen as like classy and adult and like grown up for you to enjoy it, but he already enjoyed it even when he was like a rebellious teen.
Another thing was when you were reading it, one of the things that was mentioned was like how everything was right for him, like to be a good person and like have a good productive life. Like, he had parents and whatever, and he was like the perfect ideals. Like, he even listened to classical music and did all the mature adult stuff that only like you'd expect like really good like fancy people to do, and yet he still like defied those stereotypes, I guess, or sort of something contradictive to the sort of clockwork idea that people either act one way and are good or one way and are bad.
I feel like his parents really like perpetuated that in him, because they weren't very good parents. They didn't punish or discipline, and they didn't really raise him as well as they should have, and that probably fed into him becoming rebellious and just doing whatever he wanted to do.
And you also like see that once like he leaves for jail and they come back and it's like his room's not even there, and it could be this thing of like they tried to like cut him out of like their life. Thank you for listening to Clock Talk.